Can you make money? Can you save money? Which way is it better to look at things on your homestead? On our Canadian homestead, we have grown and raised many things, and we've thought about numerous, quote, business ideas to try and earn an income from our homestead. But in the end, we always really circle back to the same thing. And in this video, we're going to discuss why that is. Even though we are a Canadian-based homestead, I do think that the information in this video is quite interesting, even for those that the regulations from the big guys don't apply to. So definitely stick with us as we kind of go over the powers that be and what they control here in Canada.
In the old days, that concept of homesteading, really one of the big things was you're supporting yourself. And I think that still is something that is applicable today. Growing your own food, raising your own food, that sort of thing. If I'm going to say it that way. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. And one of the things I think a lot of people think about right off the bat, and you see this a lot on forums and Facebook and this, that, whatever, where people have just plunged right ahead into things, thinking that if just because I do it, I'm going to, to quote something from South Park, grow something. We don't have the middle place of how to do it, and we're going to get big profits at the end. And I think that's a huge eye-opener and a huge shock to a lot of people, because there's always a market. You always have, especially with the animal products, but even with the vegetable side of things, there's always people that want what you have. But sometimes the tangled web of getting it to them, and getting it to them so that you're also not losing your shirt, so to speak, can be a really insurmountable task. So one thing kind of on that note is, at least in Canada, and I do know, although I'm not an expert in a lot of parts of the US, it's also the same. When you get into the realm of being a farm business, you're still a business, and you're still playing by a lot of those rules that are applied to any sort of similar business. And I think that's where the shocker comes in for a lot of things. So historically, that idea of being able to basically make a little bit of income, barter trade from your homestead, is a great idea. I think a lot of us would probably like to go back to that. And with barter, there may be a potential to do that. But there's value added, but then there's costs and other associated things added to that to get that value addedness out of the product. I think that's something we're going to talk about next. All right, well, we're back inside because I think the next part of this video is a little more, I'm going to say technical, because we're actually going to look at least in Canada/Ontario, some of the restrictions that come across or that are applicable to some of the potential options for taking what you do to a business scale. I think the best place to start is probably livestock, because livestock have more intrinsic value per animal unit, I'm going to say it that way, than vegetables. But when it comes to livestock, you kind of have two bigger options. We'll get into some other little minor ones after, but first would be
live sales, selling either breeding stock or meat for someone else's
live animals
for someone else's consumption. And really, I think you have two very, very different markets there. One of the things that we kind of commented was, as we looked into this, you have a breeding stock mindset of the animal has a certain value, and then you have a mindset, which we've all done, is I want that animal at the cheapest I can get it, because at the end of the day I want to feed my family. For the cheapest I can do it.
I want cheap meat. So you have two very different markets to go on there. So on the one side of the fence, the market of selling live animals that will then be butchered by somebody else, you really have to know your costs.
Yeah, that's what
because
I was gonna say.
You could potentially really lose your shirt over that one. On the flip side, and that I'm going to say, and that also includes selling them to the stockyards, for example, which is something that some people do in the area that we live in. On the flip side, the breeder's market is volatile. So without getting into all the other particulars on it, you may have X number of animals produced a year that you think are of breeder quality, but you might not always have the market for it. And then that becomes a whole nother thing of you need to be very good at marketing that, which I am going to say it. There are folks out there who are very good at that, but it's still a bit of a niche market. And so I would suggest if you're trying to make the bulk of your income that way, the vast majority of people are probably going to fail. And it's only the minority that are actually going to be able to do that successfully. So the next one is meat. And meat has a lot more, I'm going to say, restrictions to it.
With meat, we're kind of reading a little bit here off of the Ontario government site. Basically with meat, I think it pretty much applies across Canada. Just every province has their own kind of rule page. I'm going to read, quote, however you want to word it, right from their site. Whether you are a commercial livestock producer, operate a small hobby farm, or buy and sell animals for slaughter, the meat from your livestock and poultry is subject to the same requirements under the Food Safety and Quality Act 2001 and Regulations 31-5 of the Meat Regulation.
So in a nutshell, what that is basically saying, one of the things that's in there, it's kind of, as most laws and regulations, or most acts and regulations are, it's fairly complicated, and the pieces are, you've got to go find them. But essentially, the sale or distribution of uninspected meat is illegal in Ontario.
You are able to slaughter your animals at home for your own personal consumption and your immediate family's consumption. And we're just going to quickly kind of put a little posting up on the screen here for you guys to read. We're not going to go into too much detail on this, but this is where so many people, I think, get caught out in their plans for selling meat and selling meat birds and things like that, because it's based a little bit on some American bigger plans, basically being able to sell stuff you've butchered at home, which does allow you a lot more income. So there are rules on that.
So the reality for anybody growing in Canada is, if you're selling meat, it has to go through a federally or provincially inspected abattoir. That's an absolute. Or you can only basically consume it at home. So going back to sort of trying to make a profit or reduce your costs, you can kind of see at a very small scale the cost-benefit ratio where it's probably lining up here. As a supplemental income, that's one thing. But to make a business around it is going to be very challenging. There are additional rules and regulations on marking of animals, tagging of animals, transport of animals. So what about eggs?
Because that's about the next go-to, I think, for most people. I'm going to grow chickens and I'm going to sell eggs.
So eggs are interesting because in Ontario, and I think it actually applies to all of Canada, the only eggs that are actually sort of regulated are chicken eggs. If you have quail or ducks or turkeys or geese or something else that lays eggs that you want to sell,
go for it.
Pretty much, yeah, it's a free-for-all. Now, the downside to a lot of those is you may have a harder time selling it, depending on where you are. So to ramp up production on those other ones, your product is not readily attractive to your market, depending on where you are, depending on what market you have near you.
Which basically means you have to do a lot more back work in order to get your market.
Mm-hmm. And we sold duck eggs in the past, and I'm going to say it was always a hard sell for people. Once people had tried it, they tended to like it. But getting people to try it, that was always the trick. Yeah. But coming back to chickens are interesting because in a nutshell, and we'll read some of this in a moment, but in a nutshell, you're pretty much restricted to farm gate sales.
On, again, the Ontario government website, under the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, under the regulatory requirement for eggs in Ontario, ungraded eggs may only be sold to an egg dealer or egg grading station, except for those sold by producers on the farm premises directly to consumers.
So we won't get into grading versus ungraded, but basically to have them be graded, there's regulations and rules and everything that have to be in play for that, and it has to be a licensed facility, etc., which is way beyond what most homestead scale producers can do. So eggs are an option, but you are limited to a local clientele, to put it very bluntly.
And you are, I'm going to say it, those people have to come to you, so your market is even smaller. You aren't supposed to take those eggs and deliver them to people or go somewhere else and sell them at a market without them being graded. So the eggs technically are not supposed to leave the property until they're in the hands of the consumer.
If they're chicken eggs. Yeah. So what about milk? Well, milk...
Or dairy in general.
Dairy in general. Milk in Canada is very
regulated.
So essentially, without going into it too much at this point in time, you cannot sell it.
Unpasteurized milk or unsterilized milk, however you want to look at that. So under Section 18 of the Health Promotions and Protection Act, no person shall sell, offer for sale, deliver, or distribute milk or cream that has not been pasteurized or sterilized in a plant that is licensed under the Milk Act or in a plant outside Ontario that meets the standards for plants licensed under the Milk Act.
So basically, unless you can meet that, and we're not going to go into too much more details on it because you can read this piece of legislation, this act, and there's lots more tidbits in there, but if you can't meet that, you can't sell. You can't
even give it away.
Distribute it, period. So milk is a big no, unless you are going to take it to a very large business. So that kind of brings us full circle on a lot of the animal products. Now there are other things. So if you're getting into like fibers, whether it's furs, wool, or feathers, there really isn't any regulation on that. But in all those cases, you usually have to do more to get it to a point that it's saleable. Not saying that it's not possible.
But the nice thing that I always say about those type of items is they're non-perishable, which means it doesn't matter if you do all that work and it takes 5-10 years to sell the product.
As long as you have somewhere to store it.
Yes, that'll be the kicker. Another thing that a lot of people kind of venture down when it comes to the value-added product would be soaps, canned goods, things like that, especially if you happen to have your own garden and fruit trees and everything else. And again, we hit a roadblock of there are quite a few restrictions when it comes to doing cosmetic production. And yes, soap is considered a cosmetic or canned goods. Even if they're low acid food, you still have to follow vast majority of the restrictions that are applicable to any other commercial based kitchen and business.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to jump for a moment to produce.
And this is one we've really, sorry to interrupt you, but this is one that we have contemplated over and over, I think, for a couple years now. Should we, shouldn't we? Is it worth it? Is it not? It's a really, really tough one. And I'll be honest, we're not even there yet to figure out if it is something that's worth doing. But
essentially, to sell fruits and vegetables, there isn't much in the way of regulations for the raw product.
For now.
The raw product can be sold farm gate, can be sold CSA, can be sold in a farmer's market. You have a lot of options. The big thing with that is there's a lot of labor to it, and you have to find things that your market wants. So just because you can grow a lot of tomatoes doesn't necessarily mean that tomatoes are going to be a big seller for you or a very lucrative. Now, as Stephanie mentioned with the value added, it's very similar to the cosmetics. You can do it, but you do have to follow some rules and regulations.
So basically, even if you are looking at starting up a small business of just selling jams, jellies, homemade baked goods, that sort of thing, you're still subject to the regulations of the Health Protection and Promotions Act and also the Food Premise Regulation. And the Food Premise Regulation one, I have to admit, that's the kind of big one for me because you have to have a lot of things in place in your actual working area.
The best way to put this is, we're not going to go into detail, but there's a lot to digest here. And I think this is probably a take-home message for this video, is there's a lot of promising potential to make money, potential for homesteading to be lucrative when you see what others are doing in other areas. But you need to understand all of this. So you go from just feeding yourself to having to understand how to navigate these acts and rules and regulations.
And it's quite a rabbit hole.
And it's quite a rabbit hole to go down. And in some cases, like the food premise regulations, that requires inspections and things. So there's more layers to it. So hopefully this has at least been interesting. It's probably sounding a little bit negative. And to some degree, maybe it is on a smaller scale. We're not saying that it can't be done. We're not saying that you couldn't do it. We're just saying that where we sit here in 2023, if you're not already at that level that you are doing things sort of as a farm business or already having those value-added things, you need to think about all of this, because the world is not the same as what it was when homesteading basically became a thing. There's a lot more to consider, and I I'm going to say it this way: if you don't do it right, you're putting yourself and your family at a little bit of a risk. Kind of coming full circle with that, the proverbial they often say that, and I'm just using that as a catch-all phrase, that they want people to be more sustainable. They want people to buy local, shop local, eat local, all of those sort of things. But even though there is a reason for regulations and those sort of things to exist, it makes it very hard for those kind of very grassroots, local style economies that you do hear about more in the US. I will admit. I'm going to mention Joe Salatin and some of what he's been able to do over his many years of farming. It's great, but he's in a very different regulatory environment, which allows him to do a lot of things that anybody watching from Canada, you can't do. So definitely something to think about. And I think kind of to close this all off, this is why I think the important message that we're trying to get to people is there's always that temptation of, I could make money, I could make this a viable business option, support myself with my farm, etc. You can, but it's going to be difficult and it's going to be challenging. And there's many people that do make decisions to do a lot of the things we've talked about without doing it, I'm going to say air quotations, properly. And it can work out well for them, but it can also work out really bad. So if you want to reduce your risk, I think where things sit in 2023, from our perspective, having done this for many years and explored many options, basically always come to the same conclusion for us, is look at how you can grow food, raise food, however you want to divide that up, to really save money for yourself. I think one of the best things we talk about time and time again is track your expenses, know what it costs you. Do the comparison of what it would have cost you to buy something at the grocery store, and do that without even considering the value addedness of potentially a higher quality product that you could produce yourself. Because if you can do it for about the same price and you're still producing something better than what you can buy at the grocery store, that's a pretty good situation. So I think we'll leave you with that food for thought, or thought for food, and let us know what you think in the comments below if you've gotten to this part in the video. We realize this is a little bit of a more boring video, a little bit doom and gloom, but we can elaborate on some of these points. We've kind of gone through them fairly quickly for the most part. If that's something you'd like to see, let us know, and we can kind of make some more content similar to this.